Hashrate is sponsored by TAO Stats. TAO Stats is the leading Bittensor explorer. You can buy, sell, and stake Bittensor on TAO Stats. TAO Stats can be found at taostats.io, and there's a link in the Hashrate show notes description. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Hashrate. My guests today are Will and Steph from Macrocosmos, which has a subnet portfolio. So hello, gentlemen. How you doing?
Hey, doing great.
Thanks for having us back, Mark.
So you guys run sort of a portfolio of subnets, and last count on my end, it's 5. Is that correct?
It is. But I think we've been trying to focus on a couple more today. So maybe we won't talk about all 5 today. We'll just focus on a couple of the big ones, Mark.
Yeah,
I think the last time we came on with you guys must have been like the week after DTAO launched.
Yes. It's been that long. I mean, and really DTAO launched in February of this year? So
February, and we're coming up on 6 months now. I think we just passed
We just passed 6 months.
Yes. So what do you guys think? Is it working? Is it working the way we expected it to?
I think we can dedicate the entire podcast to an in-depth analysis of DTAO.
Well, you brought it up, so let's. We have to talk about it now, right? So, and I've got my own opinions on it. I mean, I think my opinion is largely yes. I have some quibbles, but largely yes. I think it's been pretty successful. What do you guys?
I think it's important to frame this against where were we before that. The root network, I think, was unambiguously not an effective allocator of funds to projects. Although it kind of came from good intentions, in practice it just didn't really work. There was a lot of cronyism. It was very difficult to allocate efficiently, I think, was part of the issue with that. So DTAO is an elegant technical solution to it. It's a very complex solution to it. And I think a lot of the builders, in fact, the entire ecosystem is still, I think, adapting to some of the minutiae of how the playbook, to put it simply. Things are very differently. Of course, now we basically have 5 public companies, which is something that we're adapting to. We certainly have to focus much more intently on certain parts of how we operate compared to what we did in the root era, which is good for us. It's healthy. We're evolving. We're growing. It's very competitive. We're kept on our toes day and night within DTAO, I'd say. But what are your thoughts?
I think I've always used this kind of simple bubble of like DTAO had like 3 components. There's the like technical building. Are you building something that's altruistic and good for the protocol and has inherent value piece? There's this piece around like crypto memetics, insider knowledge, like the trading aspect of it.
Yeah.
And then there's this piece around the functional tokenomics. And I think from a trading aspect, that's clearly been lots of fun for people. There's more technical analysis on subnet tokens than any of us need. I think there's a whole talk of sum of prices and different shifting values and other pieces. And I think that element of it has come to the fore much, much more. It's made the project much more crypto than it used to be.
Yeah.
I think the allocation perspective of DTAO itself, I think there's a lot of discussion around things like root prop. You did a great podcast with Dave Williams on that. I think pool management and understanding that you can't spend $1 infinitely has been a valuable but painful lesson for the protocol. I think people have been forced to look much more tightly at what are they spending minor capital on, return mechanisms, like thinking about the long-term health of the token. And I think on the builder aspect, there's a lot of what's being built on Bittensor is deeply complex. And what it's forced teams to do is to try and normalize that back to a simple message or something that's digestible for a retail investor, a long investor, and otherwise. I don't think we've seen DTAO's final form. I think we're seeing root prop drop off. We're seeing subnets capped. Maybe that's going to return. I do think there are improvements that can be made to make the system more attractive for investment, whether that's root weight changes, whether that's more stabilization, whatever those mechanisms you think need. We could talk about that for an hour. But I think like the allocation mechanism seems to be more effective. I think the focus on CT and hype-based news is difficult. I think the broader question I have for it is I worry we dilute the Bittensor message in a sea of subnet messages sometimes. And so I sometimes fear that we lose that big, huggy family energy we had pre-DTAO in a mixture of, trying to push your own project, perhaps to the detriment of the broader piece. So that's maybe my concern for it right now. I think there's been a lot of conversation about things like improved mechanisms for subnet owners to control emissions. How can you control pools and otherwise? And I think we do need more evolution in that space. But I think it's a work in progress, would be my view.
What it comes down to is sort of, now that you have these pools and they're becoming more liquid with time, but they're still very early and very nascent. You have to think much more about the efficiency of how your subnet operates. So you've got these various vectors of buys and sells, and inflows from the chain, outflows to all the participants. And I think that prior to DTAL, there was very little regard given to, like, some subnets can just be extremely inefficient, and they're actually just spending TAO at a rate that's just not, ultimately, it's just not competitive outside of Bittensor. And what this forces everyone to do is tie their shoelaces very carefully, because now you're responsible for making sure that the unit economics of what you're building is sustainable. Yeah. To the point, of course, where the North Star for all of the teams in Bittensor right now is to offset the deflationary pressure of the miners and the rewards going out with revenue that comes in. So now you're finding PMF in a way that I don't think the teams were forced to think about before detail.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of elements.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I do think the complexity of it has been difficult to understand. I mean, before I got on this podcast, Michael White had just asked, he's like, okay, so when the halvening occurs, do alpha tokens, halven at the same time as the main TAO token?
No, that would be too simple. That would be too simple.
And my understanding is that actually it's sort of this blendy thing where the tokens, the alpha tokens that are emitted into the pools have on the same schedule as the main TAO token. However, the alpha tokens also have their own halvening schedule for what is emitted to holders and other people that are not the pool, right? So it's which is really difficult to understand, right? Because you're sort of like, right, and I'm not positive I understand it. I think I stated it correctly, but I'm not entirely positive. And I've done a lot of reading on this topic, and the fact that it's debatable amongst people who are like neck deep in it, it's kind of hard to and you're trying to understand this as a alpha token investor, right? To understand how much you're going to be diluted by the actions of the chain, and it's very difficult to sort of get a mental head wrap around that, right? So. And if it's difficult for us, my God, the world at large is never going to figure this out.
So the simplest way to articulate this is that the TAO and alpha injected into the pool, the ratio stays identical. So half the TAO, 3,600 start going in a day, and the alpha that balances that in the pool is also halved. So the price stabilization mechanism stays identical. What doesn't stay identical is the reward paid out to subnet owners and to miners and holders. So what that means is for every time step, the pool doesn't dilute, but there's more alpha being emitted for the same size of pool. So what that means is effectively the available TAO in the pool for each alpha outside of the pool is decreased per time step. So over time, you have less fuel from the chain for the fire.
Yes. Okay. So I did state it correctly. You stated it much eloquently. But I was not wrong, so that's good to know. I would have to delete that part of the podcast. So awesome, good to know.
No, I think we were just talking about this beforehand as well. I don't know why it's suddenly a topic today, but I think there's going to be a similar war room behavior amongst subnets that there was for DTAL for the halvening about what might change, what might move. As I mentioned, we were on a call with Barry Silver earlier. He's wonderfully bullish. And his view is the TAO price will move accordingly. And in that example, you expect subnet prices will move proportionately, and the relative cost spend of each subnet actually stays pretty flat. The question is if there's a delay with that, any other function of that, and how do people make it through a period where there will be flux? When we looked at DTAL, we sort of, you could run the mathematics, you could run the simulations, but there was always going to be this knife edge of when you're over it, you don't know exactly where you're going to be on the roller coaster, an up or a down. And I expect the halvening will have some period akin to that, but I don't think anyone is fully sure yet. I think you'll start to see a lot more thought and takes on it over the coming months.
Yeah, okay. All right, let's talk about your guys' subnets. And let's start with, I guess, IOTA is probably, I think that seems to be the center of gravity of your efforts right now. You tell me if I'm wrong, but that's what it looks like from the outside looking in. And IOTA is a decentralized training engine. Incentivized orchestrated training architecture is the acronym, right? So very
That's
nice.
correct. Yeah.
So why don't you tell us what IOTA is and tell us what you guys are up to with that.
Absolutely. I can make a start on that. So, as you said correctly, the purpose of IOTA is, I think, very similar in nature to the reason why Bittensor itself was sort of imagined, which is how do we coordinate all of the compute that can be made available using the blockchain and direct that towards something as useful as possible. And of course, Bittensor's DNA is very much about AI, innovation within AI, developing the next frontier of AI. So, I mean, Subnet 9 IOTA is not a new subnet. It's in fact one of the first ever subnets to be created. And we experimented with a couple different designs. But what we learned after a year of sort of R&D is we trained some great models, but there were limits. There were limits because the way we used to approach this is it's like a competition where every participant trains their own model. And then the problem with that is it's just not the most economical way of doing it. Like training models is very expensive. So ultimately, we sort of went to lower medium scale models. We produced some excellent models at those sizes, but we found that the sort of economic cost of that, especially post DTAO, if I'm sort of connect this back to what we talked about before, it would become a lot less compelling as an opportunity, as a venture for miners. So our thinking was the right way to use all of this compute that Bittensor makes available is to smash it up into small pieces, as small as possible, in fact, and then find a way to, we basically been building what we call an orchestrator, which enables all of the miners in the network, which is 256 entities out there, and they're all running state-of-the-art hardware. And what we're doing is we're sending them tiny bits of tensors, we're sending them tiny bits of tensors that are basically getting passed down layer by layer of a large model. So what we've done is we've taken a couple of things that have been sort of proven. They're still nascent technologies, but it's called data parallelism. So you have lots of copies of a model, and each copy of the model is training furiously on lots and lots of data, and then periodically they share information so that you get the benefit of that sort of horizontal training. What we've done is we've taken that, but we've also taken these big models and we've broken them into multiple pieces as well. So imagine you have a large llama model or something like that. Well, instead of every miner having to hold an entire copy of that, which is very expensive, you need, very powerful hardware to be able to do that. What we've done is we've said, okay, well, let's instead say that a certain cohort of miners are going to run the first 5 layers of the model, and then the next cohort are going to run the next 5 layers, and so on and so on. So this gives us a massive advantage because the barrier to entry in terms of how much compute you need is lowered substantially. You no longer need an enormous amount of compute. You don't need a little data center of your own to mine on the subnet. Eventually, you'll be able to mine the subnet with a powerful laptop. Is sort of the image that we're looking towards, which is kind of a training at home dream for us. So what the subnet does today is basically we take these models, we split them to small parts, and then all of the miners in the network are basically they're shuttling around all of these smaller sections of the model, sending the data back and forth in order to train one large model copy. So it's very complex. I would go as far as to say it's the most complex subnet that's ever been built in Bittensor. Wow. And I think we're still working out some of the intricacies. I mean, these things are they're really formidable pieces of engineering. To do proper distributed training in this fashion is you need to really carefully calibrate every single part so that the whole sort of the orchestra can sing. But I'd say we're sort of at the final mile right now. We've been running some experimental runs. Things are looking great. The model's training. And of course, the longer term picture here is we start training models that are much, much larger that would be inaccessible without using what we call model parallelism. So eventually, this is a pretty major unlock to be able to train truly competitive large models in a decentralized way.
Yeah, when you say truly competitive, we're talking, the goal here is to basically square off toe to toe against ChatGPT 5 and Grok 4, right? Yeah. You're coming up with IOTA, 2000, right? And it's better than Grok and ChatGPT. That's the goal, right? So how far away are you from being able to step toe to toe to those big boys?
I think that this was one of the reasons for when we originally built Subnet 9, we spent maybe 6 months focusing on training good models. Yep. And what I mean by that is we trained really good 7B and 14 models, probably the best 14B decentralized model that's ever been trained. But the reality is bigger means better in AI model training. Right now, the state of the art is in large models. And I know there are discourses, but when you're talking about making good small models, it's often through distilling bigger models. And the state of the art models are anywhere from 800 billion to 1 trillion parameters for the really big, profound models. So when we looked at some of the architectures, things like data parallel that others have been invoking, like Noose and Templar, we looked at them and saw a natural cap of limiting participants by being able to run an 8x200, an 8B200 box. Or even, at some point you start to reach a scale where to train one of these models, you have to have 5 data centers networked, and those are the miners. So it didn't leverage the real advantages of decentralized technology. So the point of IOTA was to allow us to go really big, 100B, 1 trillion parameter in theory at some point. We're currently running experiments to basically sort of go through a step process. One is get the system training stably. We think we've reached that milestone. The second is get that system training well. The third is get that system training fast. We have a bunch of work on Diloco and Clasp, which I'll let Stefan talk to. And then the final one is get the systems trained big. So, our broad plan for this year is we're currently doing daily iterations on a 1 billion parameter model. It's very small, but it lets us check learning rates, check parameters. You start it when you go to bed and you wake up with a wave of data. Shortly after that, we'll go to a sort of 15B size model. And then the intention is to be ramping towards 100B by the end of the year. Yeah. And that's sort of a really big model that can move that. We haven't fixed on parameter sizes. We may decide we're going to go bigger, faster, or anything in between. But those are the sort of goals there because we're not limited by the maximum hardware a miner can run. And I think the final interesting anecdote I'll add to that is IOTA is probably the most forcibly collaborative training network on Bittensor. What I mean by that is in most subnets, miners compete. So if I take subnet 13, miners can scrape data in isolation. If you scrape more data, that's great. We add the data together at the top, but it's a sort of one-man band or a bunch of people playing out of unison. In IOTA, we pass work around the network. So one miner, if another miner breaks your work, you don't get paid, which has this reinforcing effect as we add defensive layers, improvements to the incentive where we either all win or none of us win, which is quite unique in a Bittensor subnet. Mostly it's about the sort of collective team winning and, as one entity, we can do more. With IOTA, it's all one football team. If somebody drops a pass, you're going to concede a goal. My football acronyms are falling down today. But it's a really interesting problem to solve. It's a really hard problem to solve. And it's something we're really excited about working on.
Okay, so that's the way you guys are thinking about it. Is it's like let's get it running at low power first and get all the coordination and synchronization. That seems to be the biggest thing to get right, or one of the biggest things. And then worry about expanding it to mega size later on in terms of the amount of iron that you're adding into it. And theoretically, if you get it right, sort of at a small scale. When you hit the gas on expanding the amount of hardware in there, the entire thing should just expand naturally. And it's sort of like the way Bitcoin does, right? Like the Bitcoin network is now the world's largest supercomputer by an order of 500x, right, to its nearest competitor. So it feels like hardware is the key, like brute force at some point is the key to getting better and better AI models. On All In, they talk about this thing called the Bitter Lesson, which you seem to be familiar with that. But my understanding of it is that the Bitter Lesson is that we humans are not that important compared to the amount of hardware that you can bring to bear on an AI problem, right? It's really just about, and that's how Elon has apparently scaled up his self-driving cars much more successfully than his competitors in some ways. And so anyway, okay, so very good.
I do subscribe to the idea of the bitter lesson. I've quoted it many times myself, and I think that it speaks to a deep truth. So basically, for the benefit of the audience, generalized methods that utilize raw compute and can scale with Moore's law will generally outperform niche human crafted architectures and algorithms. That's kind of the broad strokes of what it means. But I think that there's the generalized compute, that the devil's in the details with that. And by that, what I mean is the current paradigm right now, the world is addicted to what are called transformers. That's like the completely the accepted way of training standard and state-of-the-art models. Now, what we know about transformers is they're extraordinarily inefficient. And fortunately, you can offset that because Moore's law just keeps delivering. So far, so good, at least. Now, there's nothing to say that improving transformers to something that's a little bit more memory and data efficient will not enable us to move much faster as a research community. So the bitter lesson doesn't basically say that the architectures that we have today, we just scale them up with more data in perpetuity. I don't personally believe that that's the case. I think visionaries like Yann LeCun, who's one of the godfathers of AI, he's completely fallen out of love with transformers. Now he thinks it's a problem for engineers. He thinks that the greenfield breakthrough that we're going to see in the next couple of years is a fundamentally different architecture, which is completely at odds with the idea of the bitter lesson, which is just, we found the recipe, just stick it in the oven for longer. It's not as simple as that. It's a bit of a trope. Anyway, just wanted to throw my 2 cents in there.
Well, so I'm listening into a couple different circles. Some of them Bittensor, but some of them not. And I'm in one particular chat room where the sort of the debate right now is, have our current methodologies for producing, transformatively better AI models, has that sort of topped out? And I think the latest release of ChatGPT, which was rather unimpressive in terms of, compared to its last iteration, by almost all accounts, it's starting to get creaky, right? Like we're starting to, I think we've squeezed the towel for all the water we can get out of it. What do you guys think? Is the current architecture topping out?
I think there's some signs that we're starting to get, certainly. We've gotten a lot of the juice out of the current design, which is the transformer design. There's a lot of improvement that can be made around the data that we use to train these models. They're only as good as the data that they've seen. Ultimately, all they are imitation machines, right? You just train these things to imitate the things that they've seen in certain scenarios. And I mean, let's take, for example, there's been a lot of noise made about models trained entirely on synthetic data, like Microsoft's Phi series. Synthetic data means AI generated the data, and now you train another AI on the data that the AI made. It's kind of very weird and cyclical.
Like a copy of a copy of a copy kind of thing.
Yeah. It sounds like it shouldn't work, and it kind of works. But the problem is, when you train an AI model on AI-generated data, AI models tend to speak with a very specific tone. And this means that the model that you train on it is very adept at handling queries and bodies of text that follow the character and structure of how AIs express ideas. But if you now just were to, you're in a rush, you're typing, you're riddled with typos, you're not capitalizing, your grammar's all over the place. If you were to try and talk to an LLM like that's only seen really glossy, perfectly grammatically formatted text, it's called out of distribution. And it means that the LLM just simply doesn't know how to interpret that data. So all of this is to say that I think that there's a lot more work that the research community can do in terms of using more careful types of data. The reasoning models that are sort of the darlings of the AI world right now, they actually originate from some really basic principles, which is just, we should just feed these models a lot more examples of how to do more rigorous thinking. That's it, basically. And you can reel off a number of algorithms and techniques, and I'm not going to do that. But the main point is, if it ain't seen lots of examples of a carefully reasoned thought process, it can't imitate it. So what we've learned is transformers are very good at capturing patterns and imitating them and faithfully replaying them, which is why they're useful, especially when you offload a lot of the things that LLMs are not very adept at doing. Things like, if I ask an LLM to multiply two 11-digit numbers together, that's the most inefficient calculator in the world. You're using like 10 to the 12, 10 to the 14 flops to do something that a pocket calculator could do in the 50s.
Yeah.
So there's also just like cognitive offloading, just like humans. Like I don't do 11-digit multiplication in my head. There you go. Now you know the truth about me. I don't do that because it's incredibly error prone and it's a waste of calories, to be honest, when I know a machine can do it reliably every single time. And I think the right way to think about the next wave of AI use cases and breakthroughs is about leaning into the strengths of LLMs with the current architectures that we have, really tightening them up in critical use cases and domains, but then graciously offloading the parts of it which traditional software can handle much better, whether it's a simple calculator, a web API. That's the reason why sort of agents are flourishing. It's because they're making better use of the LLMs are the ambiguous language module that allows you to say something and it translates it into a program that can execute.
Yeah, let me ask you sort of a general question. So with the current transformer models, and you call them imitation machines, and I've used the words. They're micro plagiarism. Like basically, it's 1,000 billion micro plagiarisms, right? Like that's what they commit, and it basically does this by inhaling sentience exhaust and remixing it, right? That's sort of the way I think about it. Which I'm not
you can
sure
tell you're a sci-fi writer, Mark.
Yes, that's a sort of my sci-fi writing way of thinking of it is. And so if that's true, and it sounds like it largely is the correct description, these things cannot sort of escape the boundary of the data that it was trained on. So it's not going to come up with, actually new ideas. It is going to find new connections between existing ideas inside of the data set with which it was trained on. It's going to do that incredibly well, right?
Yeah.
But it's not going to sort of cough up a completely new branch of physics, right? Or something that's outside of its experience. Is that a correct characterization of the state of the art right now? Or am I missing something?
I think it is, but one of my university supervisors always said to me, like, the purpose of a PhD or a master's is to sort of take the full corpus of human knowledge and create a tiny pimple on the edge that is your contribution. He always framed like the dissertation was your contribution to knowledge, and I like that. And I think the reality is when you look at the corpus of human knowledge, there's spaces, there's gaps within the machine. So LLMs may not be able to create the pimple, but they can color in the space between two ideas that are congruent but not considered. And I think, people who are sort of AI mini as opposed to AI maxi will look at the current architecture and say, aha, we've beaten all of you. It didn't work. You've reached the threshold. GPT-5 is the end of it. But I think this is one of the reasons we built IOTA the way we did, and that it's not incentivized, orchestrated LLM training architecture. It's just a training architecture. Now, there's a load of very interesting and compelling AI methods that might prove to be the right one. But the reality is, with any emergent technology, people always assume, we're going to train GPT-7 and then we're never going to train again. It's not the case. As AI becomes more proliferate, as we start to use it for brewing beer, talking to our mum, managing our handbag contents, or whatever niche use case we cannot imagine it's going to be used for and we're boggled by, somebody's going to spend a huge amount of money training a model to do that. And IOTA is a bit of a play to that, about in a world where training becomes more and more and more important, the availability of low-cost, orchestrated, distributed global compute becomes more and more powerful. You can see that by something like, there was an approximation in The Economist today that 40% of US GDP growth is being driven by speculative AI investment in data centers, in GPUs, in construction, like in a contributory effect. And that's because people assume we're going to do more training. People assume we're going to spend more on inference. Everything to do with AI is going to create more economic value, and compute is the raw commodity, returning to the bitter lesson. I think one of the interesting things we've seen with the last 4 years really of the AI boom is the algorithms have leaked. And what I mean by that is, there was the grand innovation last year of the reasoning models from OpenAI, and DeepSeek came out with a reasoning model 4 months later. Because when the idea is released, it's very easy to take what is often quite a simple algorithm. the LLM architecture today was, I think, originally conceived in the 90s in some fashion. The sort of basic rules of model training and supervised learning, but it's when the compute becomes available. So if you assume that there's less of a moat than people would expect around the algorithm, the A plus B equals C in a much longer form, having systems that can organize compute to apply those algorithms becomes incredibly valuable in the long term.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about the rest of your portfolio of subnets. I know you guys, I watched a recent episode, another podcast, where you guys talked a lot about Subnet 13, Gravity. Used to be, I guess it's called Gravity now. It used to be called DataUniverse.
It's still called DataUniverse. The product's called Gravity. We probably need to simplify that.
Okay.
We got in a really spacey stage earlier this year, Mark. Too much sci-fi.
Got it. Okay, so we'll call it, so it's DataUniverse. And the idea there is that basically you've got scrapers, like the miners are basically scraping data from X, from Reddit, from YouTube, I guess you just added as well, which is, my understanding is that's sort of the richest data pile to scrape for training AI, because it's got a lot of natural language, especially on YouTube. There's a lot of sort of expository speaking on a lot of different topics. It's not like quick hit data. It's very sort of well-considered, well-constructed data, although it is conversational, so it's sort of natural in that sense. What are you guys doing with this subnet, and what is the product? Why don't you just tell the audience a little bit about what that's all about?
Yeah, I guess just quickly, the way you described the value and the purpose of the data is very similar to how I think about it too. I think that X are these like short bursts of insight at best. Short bursts of thoughts, which are, they can be useful for model training, but longer form, more thoughtful prose is generally a more powerful catalyst for these models to learn good representations, be able to imitate sort of better patterns. So Reddit's very good for that, especially because the community on Reddit, at least in the higher quality subreddits, they tend to reward and sort of upvote content that is necessarily more thoughtful, sometimes a little bit out of the distribution as well. People that think for themselves, people that are a little bit more surprising and a bit more insightful in what they have to say. And I think YouTube is, transcriptions can be, tens of thousands of tokens. These can be hours and hours long episodes. And that gives the LLM an opportunity, when it's trained on that, to really follow much more extended trains of thought and logical sort of progressions. So all three of them, the reason for DataUniverse for us was always to have our in-house data garage, where we can charge upon models, we can do data blending, but most importantly, the models are not they're not limited to when the training data that they've seen ended, because a large part of this, and it's becoming less of an issue now, but a year and a half ago, I remember it was really frustrating when I'd use ChatGPT or similar products, and I'd find that their knowledge cutoff date was a year before the day I'm using it. Yeah. And like, actually, the chances that I'm going to talk about something which happened in the last 12 months is very high. Yeah. So, they've kind of bridged it a little bit with the more agentic web search abilities, but for a while it was a real blind spot. Yeah. And so what we always thought is social media data is current to the second. It's, it's a proxy for what the world cares about. And it's all out there laid bare for the world to see. So that for us means that the models that we can produce with that data, in addition to traditional web scale data sets that all the other labs are training their models with, you sort of blend the two of them together and you get models that have a good understanding of the world up to now, which is generally much more valuable for users. But I'm happy to let you add your part.
Yeah, I think that there's very much this large-scale training vision, which is why we built the subnet. I mean, I think we have 55 billion rows of data with YouTube, which has only been online for a couple of weeks. We have 220 gigs of transcribed conversations, which is a lot of training data. So it's really, really good at hoovering up lots of information. But I think that prescience thing of how do you get data to inform opinions, give you up-to-date information is really important for modern AI systems. It's not formally announced yet, but if you go to Doug on TAO Stats and ask it about Twitter content on a subnet, it will use Subnet 13 scrapers to pull information about that subnet. So you can go check it yourself, go talk to Doug. TAO Stats is now using that to support their sort of intelligent view of the ecosystem. And so it doesn't say who shoots. It can give you what Mark Jeffries' opinions on IOTA after the podcast are going to be.
Yeah, and Doug, just for people who don't know, Doug is their AI that's on their on the TAOstats site that you go talk to. It's like their chat GPT. So anyway.
Exactly. And that all uses a system called Model Context Protocol, which basically LLMs today are trained to use tools. And Subnet 13 is a really effective tool for finding out what the world thinks today. So there's an amazing amount of integrations through the agent platform Shoots launched. I think web search and the 13 API are their most used tools. So lots of, if you want the agent to know about the world, to be a shitposting Twitter bot or whatever you want it to be, or an insightful trader, access to that data source is really, really important. And we're really pleased that it can provide that. I think we've also started to work a lot more with enterprise customers. We've cut a couple 5-figure deals this month, which we're sort of hand-holding customers through to use that data to solve problems. One really interesting use case is actually for and I won't talk about the company till it's public, but they're trying to sell services around as crypto protocols approach a certain size and a certain sentiment on Twitter, they get hacked. So what they want us to do is build effectively a signal intelligence method on top of Subnet 13, using historic data to look for, trends in SWE when it was hacked, trends in Bittensor when it was hacked, and when do these things reach a certain size that broadly you can go and say to someone you should really buy some security services now. So a really interesting example, we've been working with a bunch of brand agencies and other things, but very much turning this from a sort of proof of concept product into something we're actually driving revenue into, which is, on top of IOTA, which is very moonshot, big vision, tech of the future focused. Actually, we can start to drive monetization, drive flows back into the subnet through that. So we've got some really good traction on that over the summer, which is notoriously a slow period for sales. So we're really pleased with that.
Yeah, congratulations on all that success. So yeah, I was going to ask you, something like IOTA, right? Let's go back to that for a second. How do you, is that a revenue generating thing, or is that one of those subnets which it runs on the PBS model, right? Where it basically takes emissions and that's what sort of keeps it afloat, but it's more like a research project that is supported by, public money, if you will, the chain emissions. Or is that something which down the road you think it's a product which creates revenue and is like a normal company which creates revenue, and then you use some of that revenue to buy back the subnet token. How do you think of IOTA in terms of it as a business?
I think training is the secret sauce and the most valuable thing. So if you were to think that OpenAI were a venture capital funded research lab for 5 years that just trained models and played video games, like a lot of OpenAI's early research was they just built computers to play video games, which might sound like a public good or a novel thing, but it's training fundamental systems.
Yeah.
And I think, Bittensor's real bull run began when the large open source models from Meta were released, Llama 70B. Because before that, we were playing with very primitive tools, solar models and other things that Stefan can talk about. So we absolutely see IOTA as a very easy path to revenue, because building compute and organizing compute to train models is going to be increasingly valuable over the coming years. Being able to offer that at a cost economic price, a nationally sovereign price, whatever those balancing factors are, is going to be really, really important. So we absolutely see revenue going from that, whether it's licensing proprietary models or licensing the stack to train private models for other entities. And for us, that would be when you sort of talk to investors and talk to venture capital, it's the extremely high growth bet. It's not the public good bet. It's in the same way that Apple spends something like 60% of their engineering funding on R&D, not maintenance. And a lot of those projects, how many billions did they spend on an electric car, self-driving car division that they shelved? You're hoping that this is the one that pays off, and we have high conviction in it, which is why, we're putting more resources behind it than anything right now. Yeah. But it's absolutely not a public good. It's something that, when it works, will be impossibly valuable. By far the most valuable thing in my mind that Bittensor can produce, because the unit economics of being able to create something that's more than the sum of its parts is really, really powerful.
Got it. So my characterization was 100% wrong. It's completely the most commercial thing that you guys are doing, possibly in all of BitTensor when it gets up to scale. So
yeah, and you know the final point on that is we've built the system to handle multiple training runs. So as we move on to these sort of flagship proprietary model runs, we're also going to be looking at opportunities to train commercially at a smaller scale, or perhaps at a larger scale. But the system's always been built with that intention, and we need a flag in the sand that says this thing trains good models fast and well, and that's what we're very focused on now. But on top of those very lofty goals of competing with the OpenAIs in Grok, we have a much more tactical approach to commercialization. But it's going to take a bit longer than DataUniverse did.
Yeah, I think to add a little bit to that, I mean, the previous version of Subnet 9, we were training 5 models at a time. So at any moment of the day, we had 5 models that, well, actually hundreds of models if you consider every miner's own version, but we had 5 competitions, and each competition produces a winning model. So I think we've solved a lot of the important problems that would allow us to reach commercialization already. We've already thought very carefully about feeding special data set blends that enable these models to be more powerful. We've already thought about how do we use a single subnet to train many models at once. So that work's been done up front, and it was just a matter of sort of transplanting that logic into the new system, which fortunately is not a lot of work, and it's already done. So as Will said, the goal right now is to just demonstrate that this is a world-first architecture. It's not been done before, much less in a permissionless setting. And the permissionlessness part is a brutal mistress, because what Will was saying about the highly sort of interconnected and interdependent nature of everyone in IOTA, one bad actor can effectively, potentially pollute the group effort. So you have to be really careful at catching these early warning signs of anyone that's not, behaving in a way that the system expects. And as a result of that, if we were just doing this decentralized, we'd be done by now. But doing this in a permissionless way is really a whole other layer of fortifying the design so that a dedicated actor that comes in just to see the thing burn basically loses money and doesn't cost us anything in terms of the model quality.
Let me ask you guys sort of a generalized BitTensor question, because this has been something that's been on my mind over the last 2 weeks or so. I've been thinking a lot about, what is BitTensor? And the more I sort of study it, I'm coming around to the idea that it's not an AI thing. It's more of a generalized new way of doing capitalism. And by that, I mean, it's a way to do absolutely everything in a different manner, right? So normally in the normal world, you start a company, you raise money from a venture capitalist, and there's stock, right? And there's that whole way of doing things. And then there's the crypto way of doing things, which used to be, do an ICO, make a coin, sell the coin, raise some money, which is effectively like a stand-in for raising venture capital money. Like you sell your coin and then you got this big pile and hopefully you do something with it. Probably you won't, but maybe you do, right? So there are things that have succeeded really well, like Aave and, Uniswap, et cetera. So, it has worked on occasion. And then there's the BitTensor way of doing things, which you don't sell. I mean, it's instead of selling your ICO token, that's not what happens. There's a liquidity pool that boots up slowly over time, and you have to stake TAO. You don't sell it, you stake it to get the token for the subnet, right? So it's a very different way of thinking of everything. And also the chain sort of doles out a little bit of TAO to the subnet owner as it goes, right? And you have to you get a little bit of food and then you go a little bit further and then you get a little bit more food, right? So it's very different than getting a big blob of cash right away, which sort of incentivizes you to run away and be like, you know what, fuck this thing. I got a big pile of cash. I don't really care anymore, which is what a lot of the ICO people did. And sometimes is also what the venture capital people do, right? So they get a big giant raise from something and then become lazy, right? So it feels like a reboot of capitalism. And you can also see the fact that, there's a lot of people that are using it for things that have nothing to do with AI. And you can argue about whether that's a good idea or a bad idea. But, you got JJ doing Bitcoin mining with it, right? That has nothing to do with AI, really. It's just sort of a different thing. You now have the Bitcast network, which doesn't, I love what's going on there. I'm participating in it. But it's basically incentivizing media producers to produce media that adheres to a certain criteria, right? So it's sort of acting like the PR arm of Bittensor in a way that I find really fascinating, but it's not really, it doesn't really have anything to do with AI. And what I noticed about the Bitcast network is that it solves for a lot of inefficiencies in most ad networks at sort of multiple levels, and subsidizes it at the same time with those, with the chain emissions. So anyway, you guys get what I'm trying to say here, and what do you think about it?
I really agree with your account of this. To me, the best description of Bittensor is it's an incubator of decentralized startups. It's necessarily decentralized because, of course, all the machinery is permissionless, right? Anyone that registers a subnet slot is going to invite miners from around the world to run their mechanisms. So it's decentralized in that respect, but ultimately it's a long bet on the efficiency of large markets to allocate towards promising projects. It's an incubator. So I also don't think that there's anything that obliges Bittensor to be AI. I think AI is a really promising avenue, and I think it's a very timely narrative, and it's a very timely piece of technology. I basically, finished my PhD, and it was immediately clear that AI was what I'm going to do for 30 years because the time is now. There's an undeniable feeling that just AI's time is now. It's transforming things. The hockey stick has taken off. And I think Bittensor is really well positioned to be a catalyst for a lot of really great teams to build interesting technologies. So to me, your description of this as sort of an investment, a new imagining of capitalism is pretty on point.
Okay, what do you think, Will?
I think one of Bittensor's superpowers has been it's helped bootstrap teams into this world. I would say it's been the most successful protocol at bootstrapping teams. Ourselves, Manifold, Ready AI. Take your pick of any team in the ecosystem. They came here and they were, fed bit by the TAO emissions, and they built here. I think one of the things we haven't discovered is how do we go to the Series A, the Series B stage, because that is the sort of material part of the VC protocol. You find these outline product market fits, you prove these bits of technology, but how do you then take them to market? How do you take shoots from however many customers to 10 million customers? How do you take IOTA from training a phenomenal 70 billion parameter model to training a trillion parameter model? And I think my thesis is we're going to have more evolution around the capital allocation mechanism. I think the old thesis of 41-18, and I was in the room where Jacob invented that, so I won't speak to the level of thought that went into it, but I think we need to move to a world where we think about how we can elegantly spend the pool supply in a better way, whether that's supporting promoters, whether it's more discrete use of miners, whether it's there was originally this vision that validators would build the apps and be the front door, and that sort of failed. But we need to find, what I will say with DTAO is we feel the pressure to deliver ever more. It is very much a month by month, hoping we can keep moving and doing that and pushing what we're doing. And I think if we could put the same incentive on other parts of the 100% pie, we would lead to a better network. But I do think there's still an open question about what is the best way to capitalize the next stage the network needs? Because if you want to hire a 60-person team, the volatility of dual layers of token prices is very difficult to operate as a business owner. So, you see teams like Manifold raise money off JJ. That's one option, but you then perhaps start to fracture some of the original unity of the idea you just spoke about. So I think Bittensor's paving the way for a new theory of capitalism, but I think in the same way that when the first guy got money to build a company or build a railroad, we probably need to add more innovation on top of that to help fuel extant growth.
Yeah, no, I totally I hear you. We don't know what the recipe is yet for a successful subnet. I think we have a lot of really great candidates and a lot of really great starts. And I would say that, and I've said this before, but I feel like I've been around. I was there, Gandalf, back in the .com boom and bust, right? So I saw that wave of the internet companies, Pets.com, all those things. The 2000s, the 2010s, the ICO boom, the DeFi boom, And at every stage, I watched the companies and knew a lot of the founders, and it mostly was like a 20% pretty good or excellent, 80% garbage, 80% like, what the fuck are you thinking? Like, that's stupid, right? And I think Bittensor is the first time I have ever seen 80% pretty good. You can disagree on details, but they're at least good hypotheses for companies or projects, and 20% like, fuck that, that's dumb. And I've never seen it sort of, that high a signal to noise ratio ever. So whatever's happening here, at least at the early stages, it's better than anything else I have ever seen. And so, we've succeeded at building the best stage one of the rocket, I think. So
yeah,
Stage two is still in question.
Stage 2 sounds good to me. Yeah, I think Bittensor punches well above its weight in terms of its technical abilities as a community. Really technically literate, high level people in the community. So Stage 2 it is.
Yeah. Okay. So let me ask you let's talk about the engine itself and sort of the state of the startup engine, if you will. So right now we have this situation where we have 128 subnets, and we've frozen. There's no new subnets being allowed at the moment, which I think the pause is good. I applaud that, even though it goes against my natural sort of libertarian free market bent. But I feel like protecting the quality of the subnets and the economics of this whole project kind of in the crib. I think some parenting is warranted. Yes, we should let the child go off and cut their own way eventually. But for right now, we want to make sure that they're taught well and that we set the tone correctly. So even though it goes against my natural instincts, I feel like we're doing the right thing. What have you guys heard? Are we getting close to opening the gate back up for those 128? Are we going to start letting people back in? As far as I actually don't know the state of that. Do you guys know?
I think people are looking at it. I think there's two balancing moves. One is opening up registrations, releasing the floodgate as you framed it, and the second is sort of cleaning out the trash.
Yes.
Right now there are 44 subnets with 100% emission burn, which suggests about a third of the subnets aren't actually active, or it's some form of stasis, which is notable. So no, immediately there when we launched DTAO, we had 64 subnets. It seems like we've added another 20. Maybe lost 10 and added 30, but we're probably at 85 teams now. And so my only fear with that is, and it's the same with any investing strategy. Do you want to bet on 85 teams, or do you want to focus down on N teams? And you can split your fund in any way, but if the pie is finite and the pie is about to be cut in half, that's a sort of community investing strategy about what's best. Do you want to back the horses you've got today that are really, really moving, or do you want to sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom and hope one of them is the one that comes forward? And I think the reality is you want a mix. You want a little bit of both. But my fear is I don't think we've solved all of the sweeping up problem, and I think there's an element of that needs to be resolved to make sure that we don't have 20% emission going to dead projects.
So deregistration. So you're in favor of deregistration, of gardening, if you will.
I'm in favor of gardening. Deregistration might be the mechanism or otherwise. Whether it's deregistration or a pause on the emission flow to those subnets or something else at a certain classification, I think that the change should be more judicious about how it spends its capital, would be my way of looking at it. I think, there's no need to deregister them, when you're not subnet 129 just because I don't want to accidentally insult a team with saying something random. But I don't think necessarily they need to be banished, but I think better monitoring of activity and, ultimately TAO investors don't want to be investing in dead projects. So I think some method to focus the spend on teams that are spending money and building and, here every day, I think is important. I see a lot of that in the ecosystem.
Yeah, agreed. I agree totally.
I think there's an evolution necessary on more than just that front. I refer to that loosely as sort of free riders. Okay, so they're consuming some of the emissions without adding a huge amount of value in return for that. And this is sort of a macrocosm of the microcosm within subnets, where you've got different types of miners that are trying to get an easy ride. You've got free riders that are just not doing much work and trying to make a little bit. And then you've kind of got dedicated, targeted attackers, which are actually actively trying to undermine the system. For me, I've seen a couple of concerning waves of teams that have come in very disingenuously and have actually extracted from the protocol, not through being passive, but through being very active and motivated, but necessarily not honest or upfront about what they're doing. So I think it's easy to refer to the passive component of what we see in the subnets today and say we should prune that away. But as a community, we also need to become more shrewd and more mature in the way that we think about, we've opened the floodgates. This is a permissionless network, which means that everyone is entitled to come here and build. And we just need to grow wiser as a community about how do we allocate in a way that is fair attribution for value added.
Yeah, I think, one final point to add to that is one of the things we've always tried to focus on as a business is doing work that we believe can move the TAO price. I think there's a myopic focus on subnet prices and gaming the balancing mechanisms of DTAO. And, with IOTA and DataUniverse and a lot of our work, we're trying to move TAO, which is hard. You have to do something that catches the attention of investors, of the AI, of the AI clergy. I'm not going to say Illuminati. I'm not as much of a conspiracy theorist as some people in the project. But I think there are other people who aren't. You mentioned the TAO hash earlier, and I think JJ and Voon pioneered a new idea of incentive mechanism. Whether you believe it's good or not, they've taken immense amounts of feedback from Jacob and others, and they're working to evolve it and make it fit. There's another subnet that launched a fork of that they know doesn't work. It's been critiqued, and it's a scam. And I'm not going to name that subnet team, but I spoke to the engineer behind it who covers up his engineering as a scam, and it's a scam, and it's taking TAO holders' money, and it's a waste of emission, and it will, if we permission too much stuff like that, the protocol will die. And, there's always been grift in crypto, but, people running these different named hash subnets that don't have an intent about how these things work long term, I think for me are a problem. And, it could be any pet hatred for whatever. Like I call that out one just because it's something I'm aware of, and I cause a concern because that is never something that will take TAO to 10,000. It might be something that makes you $1 this year, but it is not the thing that drives value. The final vision of the hash subnet that Voon and JJ have in mind might be, those guys are great, but the crude articulation of something that was already called out as didn't working is not it, and that frustrates me. And I think you see in Bittensor a lot of sort of shadow projects is one thing I'd note, where people copy someone's idea and do a slightly shitter version of it. Yeah. And I think, that those things are not what will drive the protocol forward.
Yeah, I know the project you're referring to, the Hashi project, the other one, and they've reached out to me to do a hash rate on them, and I'm like, no.
There was a long conversation in the Discord. I had conversations with that team, and look, I have my opinions on it. I won't name them in public. I've spoken to them privately, but I think those are the things that will poison and kill this protocol personally, and I feel quite strongly about that, because I think if we don't speak out on those things we think are valuable, I feel as a TAO holder, I feel more intentional about that than I do as a subnet builder.
Yeah, there's definitely amongst all of the people who are very serious about building high quality projects on Bittensor, and especially people who have been around in Bittensor, like you guys have, you're OGs in the Bittensor space. There's a high degree of pride and, I don't want to say protectionism because that's the wrong word, but motherly instinct to protect the protocol against interlopers. I saw that. I misinterpreted some of that was directed towards another subnet, which I'm not going to name. There was a novelty search where that other subnet appeared. I felt that they didn't get a fair shake, and it's just sort of my opinion. But in retrospect, I didn't understand this sort of point of view that you're expressing right now to the degree that I do at this point in history. I understand a lot better. You're trying to protect the protocol from the emissions rewarding bad behavior, and I applaud that instinct. And at the time that this event occurred, I didn't have a deep enough appreciation for your point of view. And I have a much, now that I've been here a little bit longer and I've been listening to a lot more conversations between OGs as well as some new Gs, I have a much deeper appreciation of that part of the point of view. And I too am protective of.
You're an OG now, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, didn't take long, but yeah, it's a new enough project that I sort of am at this point. But yeah, no, and I'm very happy to be here. So I'm very happy to know high quality individuals like yourselves. So I'm glad that you came back on our show. So thank you. So, well, the hour is up. So do you guys want to, any final thoughts before we go?
Pip install Macrocosmos. Come and play.
Yes.
There you go.
Okay. All right. Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. My name is Mark Jeffrey.
Thanks, Mark.
Been Hash
Thanks
Rate.
so much for having us, Mark.
We'll see you all next time.